Genpei Touma Den Kan no Ni is the console-exclusive sequel to Namco's Genpei Touma Den. It dropped back in 1992, 6 years after the release of the first arcade entry, and was developed by Now Production, a Japanese company responsible for a few major titles back in the day. Unlike the first Genpei Touma Den, which was later ported to the PC Engine in 1990, this one made its way out of Japan and onto the TurboGrafx-16 under the name samuraighost. I'll show a couple comparison clips of the two versions in this review today, but they're mostly the same game, aside from a few minor differences. Samuraighost appears to have some color palette changes, and it's missing the entire intro for some reason. Fortunately, they did translate it flawlessly to English for this Western release, so I guess that makes up for it. Hurting Zone. I've already covered both versions of Genpei Touma Den on this channel, and I recommend that you watch that video before digging into this, as I'll be referencing it occasionally. For those who might have missed it or can't be bothered, let me just recap by saying that I really dug the setup of that game. It was an ambitious title for the time, but I felt that it stumbled when it came to the controls, and the cheap difficulty spikes were a direct result of poorly implemented mechanics, rather than a solid, fair challenge. The action sequences were varied with its 3 distinct perspectives. This sequel boils things down by getting rid of 2 of those gameplay modes. The overhead gauntlet sequences are gone, as are the frantic action platformer ones. This sequel solely focuses on the janky-looking close-up hack-and-slash portions of that game, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your perspective. Personally, I think it's a disappointing downgrade in these ways. Genpei Touma Den might not be perfect, but the action variety was enough of a hook to at least make it interesting. The different gameplay modes were an enticing gimmick, though I guess it could be argued that getting rid of 2 of them was a good decision, since here, I guess the developer's attention was more focused. Maybe it helped them refine the combat system without having to spend time splitting it 3 ways. This sequel and its gameplay does feel tighter and more refined, but that's all relative. It will still likely take you a few moments to get used to this weird ragdoll dude and his spastic marionette arms. This thing feels better, but it's certainly not perfect. In Genpei Touma Den Kan no Ni, you take control of the protagonist from the previous adventure, Taira no Kagekyo, a character based off of real historical events during the Genpei War. This time, however, he's a resurrected specter, hence the name of the Western alternative, samuraighost. The narrative and gameplay is much more focused on the supernatural, with a fantastical dreamlike quality to it. You'll once again traverse Japan from an overhead map, but unlike its predecessor, you have no control over Kagekyo and his weird, wild, wacky extremities. This is a very straightforward action hack-and-slasher with a linear path. Basically, you start out at the beginning of a themed world, make your way from point A to B, fight a few bosses, and get tossed back out to the overworld map, where you'll see your ghostly protagonist walk onwards, as everything bursts into flames behind him. This feels more like an arcade game than its predecessor. It's very basic. The monotony gets occasionally broken up with some jarring bonus rounds, complete with whimsical music and bright visuals. These feel really out of place when juxtaposed with the bleak, hellish landscapes that make up the rest of the game, but hey, at least they're different. Throughout the many stages, there are items and power-ups to collect, but rarely do any of them feel important. Like, these colorful orbs are almost always bouncing around the screen, but upgrades and weapon buffs are rare to come across, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. When you do get an offensive perk, they only last a few moments, which just feels underwhelming. I mean, they pack a mighty wallop, but when you can only hit a handful of enemies each time, it just feels like a tease. It's like the game never wants to be anything better than average. When you nab a power-up, it should be exciting, but this thing is always yanking on that leash, preventing you from truly going hog wild. If you're going to put such a harsh limit on my badassery, at least make meaningful perks more plentiful. Hey look, a somersault attack. Oh, this is great fun. Oh, that didn't last too long. I guess it's back to the repetitive, mundane grind of walking right, clunkily ragdolling my way through yet another short, linear stage. Genpei Touma Den. The health system is the same as it was in the first game, with candles representing your life meter. You can find some upgrades here and there, but other than that, it's pretty basic. When you die, you get sent back to the beginning of a stage. Once you've drained all of your credits, a continue can be used, which sends you to the first area of a world. Yoda Lady returns to say things, and her voice is pretty clear, as is the majority of the sound here. The audio is the star of the show. Miyoshi Okuyama's score is excellent, with some great driving pieces of music. There's a lot of depth, with some approximated guitar leads that sound like something from a 70s prog rock album. Other stage themes have a swanky jazz thing going on, which I really dig. It's one of the only things that keeps me coming back to this game for more. There's a lot of variety, and all of the tunes are catchy. For more on the music, be sure to check out our VGM 101 podcast, where we've covered quite a few pieces from this game. Samurai Ghost is an impressive looking game. I say impressive in lieu of beautiful because I'm not entirely convinced that I like the way the main character looks or moves. He's a bit more fluid in this one, but he still convulses about like something from a cheap web browser experience. You can move your limbs and weapon in almost any direction. If you hold down the action button, your sword will lock in whatever position you last inputted, which works well to block enemy attacks. That is, when it works. There are times when I'm certain that I'm blocking, but enemies still sneak a hit in. It's over-designed but feels par for the course, and could be a me problem, so I'm not going to belabor this point. The game is a clusterfuck of nonsense at times, so you just kind of have to grin and bear the inconsistencies if you want to enjoy it, I guess. And for the most part, I do enjoy the game, that is, relatively speaking. It's mechanically superior when compared to its predecessor. After all, there aren't any inescapable pits to fall into, so yeah, I guess it's better with all of the quotes around better. That's kind of like saying I prefer this one because it functions like a real video game, with platforms that work properly and a difficulty curve that doesn't feel tough just for the sake of stealing my pocket change. A+, 10 out of 10, relatively speaking, of course. I'll stop saying relatively now, probably, unless I say it again later. I think the game looks good despite some of the character animations. The backgrounds change frequently, there's a ton of depth, color, detail, movement, and parallax scrolling going on behind your fidgety samurai fuck, and a lot of the enemies and traps look really good. I mean, some don't, but for the most part, I dig the style they were going for here, even if it does feel like several different art departments contributed ideas, and they just went with all of them. bosses are significantly better than those from the original title, which isn't a particularly impressive feat considering how limited all of them were in that one. A lot of them still feel like acts of attrition, but they improve as the game goes on. The first few will often dart around and spaz out attacks, but toward the latter half of the game, their patterns become more deliberate, so they feel less like button-mashing spam fests. I particularly enjoy this butterfly woman boss. She hits like a truck, but her attacks are telegraphed well, so it actually feels like a satisfying duel. The same goes for this returning big bad from the first game and a few others. These battles are often introduced well, with unique character animations. They also take place in really nice looking arenas. Those are some of the good things. I have a few more notes, but I'm having a tough time articulating my points concisely here. This review is starting to sound like a jumbled mess of opinions with a lack of a cohesive through line or any satisfying segues. For the rest of this thing, I'm just going to pour through my notes and toss a few points out arbitrarily. In other words, let's just get this thing over with, shall we? There are a handful of stage gimmicks to prevent this thing from being a complete slog. Ice physics, decaying grounds, lava pushing you along. They're nice additions, but a few more would have helped, particularly in the latter areas, where you start to feel like you're going through the paces. Enemies aren't as annoying as the ones from the first, but they still have the tendency to appear out of nowhere, sometimes right on top of you, which can be extra frustrating since there are little to no invincibility frames. You'll suffer from a great deal of knockback as well, but there aren't a ton of bottomless pits to fall into, so this is more of a minor nuisance than anything. This is admittedly a weird one. I get slightly bothered that you can start moving while the intro music plays before each stage. Yeah, I'm not sure why this drives me so crazy, but it almost makes me uncomfortable, anxious even. It's weird. I would have preferred if the theme played out and then I could move my spindly samurai. On the other hand, waiting around could get annoying because there are a lot of levels in this game, but it's still something that irrationally irks me, way more than it should. So yeah, that's Genpei Touma Den Kan no Ni, or Samurai Ghost. At the end of the day, I think it improves on some of the mechanical issues present in the first entry, but it also lacks most of its ingenuity and soul. The controls are a lot tighter, the music is great, and I do appreciate some of the late game boss battles, but ultimately, I find the entire thing to be a middling experience. The game isn't offensively bad, it's just unremarkable, forgettable, and bland for the most part. It lacks a hook. There's little to no pizzazz outside of some of the visuals and the soundtrack. The protagonist looks like a reject from the island of misfit toys, and that's just something I can't get over. Honestly, being this dull might actually be worse than being terrible. At least if a game's awful, there's something to talk about. Samurai Ghost is a flavorless pint of room temperature tap water served in a colorful, decorative vessel. It's not bad, but there's really no point in playing it when there are so many other good things out there. Next time on this channel, something completely different. So, stay tuned.